To conclude this module, we'll now dive into another exciting feature React offers you that can help you avoid overly long chains of passing props around. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. We have our person component here, and let's say now we also manage some authentication status in this application, and I want to output whether we're authenticated down here in my person component. I want to manage the authentication in the cockpit though. So in the cockpit component, I'll add another extra button and add a caption of login. Of course, that is totally up to you. And register on-click listener. And I don't want to manage my authentication status in here. I just want to trigger a change to it with logging in here. So I expect to get with a prop, let's say login prop. And of course, you can choose any name you want. Now we do use our cockpit component in the app.js file. And in there, we now need to pass a login prop because we're expecting this in the cockpit component. We just added it here. Now in the app.js file, we now need to add a method that does something when that login is triggered. So when this button is clicked in the cockpit. For this, I'll add a new method here, authenticate or login handler. And all I want to do is I want to set some authentication state here to true. So let's go to the state, and in there, let's add authenticated and set this to false. So by default, the user is not authenticated, let's say. And of course, we're not adding real authentication here. We'll do this later in the app, but not right now. And in the login handler, I can then call this set state and set authenticated to true, like that. The login handler is what I now pass to the cockpit component here on login. So this login handler. So all good. Now we're managing the authentication status in the app component. But we want to use that in a person component. Now we only have access to the persons, so multiple persons component in our app.js file. So there we can pass our information, let's say on a is authenticated prop, and that prop name here is of course totally up to you. And what I pass down is this state authenticated. In the persons component, I'm not interested in that. I want to forward it to the person component. So there I can forward is auth just to mix up the names. This name is of course also up to you. And I forward props is authenticated. So that prop we're passing in from app.js here is authenticated. We're passing to persons. Inside of persons, I'm forwarding this to is auth. And this is a class-based component, so it's this props, of course. So now in person, we get is auth as a property. And in here, I can now ultimately conditionally output a paragraph and check if this props is auth, if this is true. And then I want to output a paragraph where I say authenticated. And otherwise, I'll say, please log in. Let's save that and see it in action. This reloads. Here's our login button. And if I click that login button now, we see authenticated in all these components. So passing the data around works just as it should. And yet I'm not really happy with my setup here, because we're passing down props across multiple levels. And for example, the persons component really only forwards the authentication status. It receives is authenticated as a prop, but it doesn't really care. And this is not so great because it simply leads to extra redundancy, and it makes our components a bit less reusable. Because wherever we're using the persons component, we have to make sure we pass in is authenticated so that we can forward it. And there we have a feature called context, which helps us solve the issue. Context was introduced by React, and it helps us handle cases like this, where you need certain data, certain state in multiple components, and you don't want to pass that state across multiple layers of components just to get it from component A at the top to component D at the very bottom, when the components B, C in between don't really care about it. And that's exactly the use case here. We want to skip the persons component, and with the React context feature, we can do that. How does it work then?